Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the country you are in, and welcome to today's 45th bi-monthly Breastfeeding Coalition's webinar. My name is Megan Renner, and I am filling in today for Kinkini Banerjee, our Coalition's Relations Manager, who is attending a fabulous workshop out in the San Francisco area. So I will be filling in and subbing as your moderator today from snowy and cold Chicago. As everyone knows, the USBC and the CDC Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity co-host this bi-monthly webinar series. And the webinars are held every 2 months on the even-numbered months, second Tuesdays from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and bring together state, territorial, and tribal breastfeeding coalitions to share and network across borders, across states. Just a couple of quick announcements that we will do to remind folks, and especially for newer folks, how to access both the national webinars and the regional calls that occur directly after them. The national webinar access is open to any and all interested Breastfeeding Coalition members, and this link that you see here is how you sign up to receive those announcement emails. It's just www.usbreastfeeding.org/sign up, and you can join there if you have not been on that list previously. Immediately following this webinar, there will be regional networking calls for all 7 of the geographic coalition's regions, as well as the tribal region. And each state or territory coalition has 5 lines to dial in. And those access information for those lines was always sent to the coalition-designated contributors, and they have distributed that and managed that use of those 5 call lines for their coalition. The webinar slides and handouts for today, and as well as the archives and recordings of the past sessions, are all found on the USBC website. You can either follow the link that was provided in your webinar confirmation email from GoToWebinar, or this is also a way to get to that archive information directly from our website. If you go to the home page, usbreastfeeding.org, there will be a quick links box on the lower right, and here you can see where this little red arrow is. Down on the right-hand side, under Quick Links, it is the 4th link down, Bi-Monthly Coalitions Webinars, and that will take you right to where you need to go to find the slides and handouts for today's presentations. During today's session, all of you will be in listen-only mode during the presentations, and you can submit questions, however, at any time by typing them into the questions box on your webinar control panel. And so here you now see a view of what that box will look like for the questions box. On the left-hand side, you can see there's this blue bar for questions, and right below that it says type question here. So that's where you would type in any questions or comments that you have. And again, you can do that at any time throughout the webinar. We will have both presenters do their presentations first, and then we'll have a question and answer session towards the end. If what you're seeing right now looks like what you see on the right half of the screen, where this questions blue bar has the arrow pointing to the right, all you need to do is just click on that little gray arrow next to the Q, and it will pop down so that you have the space to type into. So that sometimes that happens. The webinar control panel might close up, and you can pop that back down by clicking the arrow. If at any time during the session you have audio problems, other questions about the technology that we're using, you can send an email to the office account, the office@usbreastfeeding.org, and Cheryl Lebetovich on our team is manning that and is available to answer any technical questions that you have. So without further ado, I will tell you a little bit about today's topic and our presenters. And the topic for today is the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition's Action Model, an innovative strategy toward evidence-based advocacy. And we have 2 great presenters from the Connecticut Coalition today that will be presenting about this model. And the introduction that we have is stating that state coalitions are striving to activate systems change that improve outcomes, are often challenged by the complexity of factors involved and by the limited resources that are available to provide organization, direction, and accountability toward the organization's mission. Connecticut's action model, and the action stands for Accelerating Coalitions Toward Improved Outcomes Now, The action model for state coalitions introduces a framework that may assist coalitions with activities that are evidence-based and therefore capable of achieving meaningful and measurable outcomes. Guided by the Surgeon General's call to action, but adapted for use at the state level, the action model integrates critical multidisciplinary concepts to provide further direction and accountability. Our presenters today will introduce the model in the context of evidence-based advocacy for state coalitions and provide a salient example of how the model may be operationalized. And we have two presenters from Connecticut today. First, Michelle Griswold. Michelle has been an RN for 25 years, working in diverse clinical settings, and an IBCLC for 13 years. She was a founding member of the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition, or the CDC, was the first elected chair in 2003, and has served as the current chair since 2010. She was also co-director of the Connecticut Breastfeeding Initiative, a statewide program overseen by the Connecticut Department of Public Health, with CDC funding to assist 10 maternity facilities towards baby-friendly designation. And we also have Michelle Vancour. Michelle has been a professor of public health at Southern Connecticut State University for 16 years, teaching maternal and child health and health promotion. In 2001, she began conducting research highlighting women's struggles with breastfeeding once they returned to their academic positions, and her findings have resulted in the establishment of SCSU's Lactation Room and Support Program. Michelle is a past president of the College and University Work-Life Family Association, and there she has witnessed firsthand the challenges associated with implementing breastfeeding practices on college and university campuses. Michelle is also a member of the CBC, the Connecticut Coalition's Board of Directors, responsible for adapting and interpreting the research and surveillance section of the Surgeon General's call to action to inform evidence-based advocacy efforts at the state level. There's many more things that we could say about these two fabulous ladies in their bios, but we want to get right to the presentations. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Michelle Griswold. And Michelle, you should have control.
Okay. Let's see.
And we can see your screen.
Okay. Whoops. Sorry about that.
There you go. You're good to go.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Megan. Thank you so much. And thanks to USBC and to CDC for inviting us to share the work that we do in Connecticut to promote, protect, and support breastfeeding. I also want to quickly thank my friend and Coalition board member and co-presenter, Dr. Michelle Vancour. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to present a framework for state breastfeeding coalitions to consider as a potentially useful tool to guide the work that we're all trying to accomplish in our own states. We presented this model as a poster at the last USBC national meeting when we just began to implement the model, and we've continued to see the value in how this model can underpin our coalition work in Connecticut. So we'll look forward to you all sharing your thoughts and your questions at the end as we continue to refine this model to improve the work that we do. We hope that it will be useful to coalitions in any stage of their development. Before I begin, I also want to just take a moment to acknowledge the people and organizations who have influenced and supported the CBC through the years. There are, of course, far too many to name, but hopefully they know who they are and know that we're grateful for all their support. I don't have any financial disclosures other than to state that our coalition runs entirely on volunteer efforts, as do many other coalitions in the U.S. And this photo here is one of our fearless undergrad public health interns, also named Michelle, if you can believe that. So for today, the plan is to briefly cover the essentials of coalition work in kind of a generic way. Despite that our states and territories and tribal regions are diverse, the essence of our coalition work is the same. After that, I'll discuss what it means to practice evidence-based advocacy in the context of community breastfeeding coalition work, and then I'll present the action model. As Megan mentioned, that stands for Accelerating Coalitions Toward Improved Outcomes Now. And the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition, which I'll refer to as CBC, developed this model based on the Surgeon General's call to action to help guide the selection of our activities as well as other organizational processes of our coalition work. and then I'll hand the presentation over to Dr. Vancourt so she can provide you with just one current example of how the CBC is using the model to accelerate evidence-based advocacy efforts with regard to breastfeeding in our state. I wanted to just begin with a snapshot here of some data that's specific to Connecticut. As you all know, we're located in New England in the northeast part of the country. We have a population of about 3.6 million people, and Connecticut has about 37,000 births per year, with almost 1/4 of those occurring in baby-friendly designated facilities. According to the most recent CDC report card, according to my calculations, that places us 3rd in the nation in this category, and of course we're so proud of that. And this is the part where I like to imagine applause if we were together in one room. And then just a quick snapshot here of our breastfeeding rates. As you can see, we're not the highest in the nation, nor are we the lowest. But as a state coalition leader, when I look at this breastfeeding data, I see two things. And the first is how far we've come in the past decade. And the second is that we still have some work to do. This slide shows just a glimpse of the trajectory of our coalition. One of the handouts that I sent that you should all have highlights our activities in a more detailed way. But just to give you a glimpse, we were convened by the Connecticut Department of Public Health in 2001 and incorporated in the state at that time. We spent years developing our bylaws, organizational structure. We held conferences like many of you to raise some money and to raise awareness. Began to build our partnerships, and just a few years ago we finally obtained our 501c3, our nonprofit status, which was a big jump for us and took us a long time to get there. Our mission, like many of you coalitions out there and many other community coalitions in general, is a health-focused mission. I've been very honored, of course, and fortunate to have been involved in the CBC since the beginning. I've served in lots of different capacities with our coalition, so I feel like I have an understanding of what it takes to build a coalition from the ground up, at least here in Connecticut. And my observation is that we collectively, as a nation, have come a long way in a relatively short time with regard to breastfeeding. But these past few years have been particularly exciting, I think, given the national attention that breastfeeding has seen. For example, the amendment to the Fair Labor Standard Act that includes breastfeeding provisions now for employees. There's been a surge of support for the Baby-Friendly Hospital Initiative via the CPPW funding and the NICHQ initiative, and that's allowed many states to accelerate the implementation of baby-friendly practices, including Connecticut. But perhaps the most significant for the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition was the release of the Surgeon General's call to action to support breastfeeding. So I'll return to that document shortly, but before that, I just want to take a minute or two to discuss the essence of coalition work. Coalitions create change. That's essentially what we do. And although the ultimate goal of many community coalitions aims to impact health, we essentially do that indirectly by creating change. In the process, as many of you know, of creating that change is very complex. For example, before we even get to the breastfeeding part in state breastfeeding coalitions, we have to consider factors such as recruiting our members, establishing leadership, writing bylaws, generating resources, building partnerships, and the list goes on. It may be reassuring for some coalitions, for ours too, to know that the complexity involved in coalition building is actually well documented in the literature from fields such as community psychology and other organizational and behavioral disciplines as well. So the question for coalitions is, can we state breastfeeding coalitions actually improve breastfeeding outcomes in our communities as our missions would have us do? The answer to that question is I don't know. Because although coalitions are designed to impact community health outcomes in theory, the evidence for their capacity to do so is mixed. So that's the disappointing news, but the encouraging news is that research also suggests that coalitions are well positioned to achieve goals that are closer to their actual work, also known as proximal goals, and that it's those proximal goals that impact community changes. Therefore, it may be advantageous for coalitions to focus on achieving proximal goals as a way to improve breastfeeding outcomes. So in short, I'm suggesting that we can impact our breastfeeding outcomes by strengthening the following elements of our coalition work. Collaboration efforts, those are things like coalition operations and our missions and bylaws, how we manage our funds, our websites, our social media, etc. Next, by strengthening our proximal goals, specifically by targeting relationships and knowledge at the local level. And in so doing, we may have a greater chance to impact actual breastfeeding outcomes. So first, we acknowledge the importance of having the formation and development in order, but I'd like to focus more on those proximal outcomes. First, relationships. And why relationships? And that's because coalitions promote collaboration. And collaboration is essentially a relationship-based approach to change. The community coalition model is one that resonates with so many of us because it appeals to shared values by specifically encouraging people to cooperatively seek solutions to health problems within their own communities that would be impossible to solve by any one entity. And people like to get together and solve problems together. So in theory, community members can come together to collaboratively solve problems by creating change. But the reality is we have to make decisions about how we do that. So how do we practice a collaborative approach to change? And that will vary widely from one coalition to another, as it should because of the diversity we see in one community to another. So now let's move from relationships to knowledge as a way to think about how we make decisions about our actions and how we can begin to move toward evidence-based advocacy. Collaborative partnerships or coalitions have been characterized as information exchange networks and learning organizations, where members become motivated to participate, but they also develop aptitude and skills over time and therefore build community capacity, in our case, regarding breastfeeding. So these are proximal or intermediate goals, and these are what are believed to create the lasting community change. So relationships and knowledge may help to explain how coalitions can create meaningful changes in health. But as we move to our next section on evidence-based advocacy, I want to highlight one more important thing about knowledge. There's a subtle yet distinct difference between what we know and how we know it. There are a lot of people in our communities who know a lot about breastfeeding. If you think about it, mothers know about breastfeeding, children know about breastfeeding, healthcare providers know about breastfeeding, dads know about breastfeeding. But we all know about breastfeeding in different ways and in our own ways. So knowledge really is what we know. Evidence refers to how we know it. And evidence-based advocacy is concerned with how we know what we know. And we'll move on to that in a minute, but I just want to review the key points that have been presented so far. So in case there are people out there who didn't know, coalition work is extremely complex. Coalitions create changes in the community, but it's difficult to measure direct impact on health outcomes. It may be useful for us to focus on indirect or proximal goals toward community-wide changes in health, rather than an ultimate goal of changing health or health behavior. As I trust you're all aware, there's no shortage of disciplines employing evidence-based practice. Examples include evidence-based medicine, evidence-based nursing, evidence-based policy, and this list can go on. And this is just one example here of a definition pertaining to evidence-based public health practice, and I think it's relevant for our work. It reads, evidence-based public health can be defined as a public health endeavor in which there is an informed, explicit, and judicious use of evidence that has been derived from any variety of science and social science research and evaluation methods. I think there are two important pieces to this definition, and the first is the use of a particular type of evidence. So here, derived from science and social science research and evaluation. The second is an emphasis on clear reasoning in the process of interpreting that evidence. To my knowledge, the term evidence-based is only beginning to be used in the context of advocacy, so it's kind of new on the evidence-based scene, which means that it's also somewhat challenging to find a concrete definition to guide evidence-based breastfeeding advocacy. A quick web search will return specific applications such as evidence-based advocacy in HIV or family violence, but these don't necessarily fit for our state breastfeeding coalition work. But if we combine what we know about evidence and what we know about advocacy and what we know about evidence-based public health practice, we might begin to develop our own definitions specific to the work of state breastfeeding coalitions. So I took a shot here at a breastfeeding coalition specific definition, and that is any collaborative action resulting from the skillful interpretation of available evidence and intended to promote, protect, and support breastfeeding at the local, state, national, and international levels. And this definition may or may not stick, and it may or may not be quite right. In fact, even in the last 24 hours, I've thought of how that might be improved. However, it might help us as coalition leaders and members and volunteers to begin to bridge the gap between what we know and how we know it, and therefore be more specific and deliberate about the actions we take to affect change in our communities. You might notice in this definition that I haven't included any specific type of evidence, and that was deliberate. And that's because it's been our experience of building a breastfeeding coalition from the ground up that peer-reviewed scientific evidence is important, but it's not necessarily sufficient on its own to account for the many other complexities of advocacy work. So then we might ask what types of evidence are applicable to our work. This is just a beginning list, but I think it's important to acknowledge that whereas some clinical health professions, such as medicine, may need to rely heavily on evidence that's generated through the scientific methods with the greatest rigor, like randomized control trials, I don't think that's the case with evidence-based advocacy. The interpretation part of the advocacy definition is really important with regard to breastfeeding. Skillful interpretation of whatever source of evidence is available is critical toward the practice of evidence-based advocacy. The actions that we undertake as coalitions will likely need to use a broad variety of sources, and some of those will have been validated through peer review, but others that are important locally, such as cultural norms, as just one example, will also need to be considered and then validated by those who are equipped to interpret that knowledge locally. So the key points to evidence-based advocacy, I think, with regard to breastfeeding is that there's a difference between knowledge and evidence. Knowledge is what we know, and evidence is how we know it. The concept of evidence-based advocacy is not yet well defined, and it's not defined at all in terms of breastfeeding advocacy, at least not that I was able to find. It seems reasonable that breastfeeding advocates consider what types of evidence are acceptable to guide breastfeeding advocacy efforts. And this is in order to move toward actions that can strengthen coalition relationships and knowledge toward improved breastfeeding outcomes. Which leads us back to the Surgeon General's call to action that was published in 2011. I expect that most participants today are familiar with the call to action, but just in case, I tried to highlight the key elements here. Of course, we acknowledge that the call to action was written as a national model of action, and therefore it wouldn't have addressed coalition work per se. We found in Connecticut, though, that it could be adapted to the state level on both the organizational and practice levels of our coalition work. So beginning in 2011, the CBC moved forward to develop a comprehensive evidence-based advocacy model to support breastfeeding in our state. This is really just a visual representation of the model, and I hope you all received the attachment that came with the key that looks like this. It might be helpful to have that to follow along, but it's not necessary, but this was part of the handouts. Although the model is based largely on the call to action, it's also based on the essence of advocacy work, and so therefore it attempts to move our coalition and perhaps others, if it's applicable to others, toward evidence-based advocacy. So here you can see shaded in purple, I'll try to use my pen here. Shaded in purple, the model is essentially organized according to the 6 sectors, like pieces of pie. And the dashed lines in between represent the idea that there's really no clear boundary between them. They're all interrelated. In keeping with that, the yellow segments correspond with the action steps cited in the call to action for each sector. And these provide us with empirical evidence regarding specific interventions. The center of the model in red represents individuals across the lifespan, but in contrast to an ecological model that might recognize the individual or the breastfeeding dyad at the center, this model doesn't specify an individual or a dyad, because as an advocacy organization, we have to understand that our efforts and our activities may target any individual, such as an adolescent woman, grandmothers, or even men in any stage of development. And that's just a little foreshadowing for Michelle Vancourt. The orange circle represents the barriers identified by the call to action, and therefore that can provide us with further empirical evidence to select our activities. I see these barriers as pretty universal and broad enough that they would likely be relevant in any community. Ultimately, the coalition mission, expressed here as a blue arrow, should anchor the work of the organization, but the mission of the organization is typically developed based on the unique breastfeeding profile, here in green, of the individual state or the region, for example, specific breastfeeding rates, state laws or lack thereof, available partnerships, the demographics, and of course the health disparity profile of the state or region. Finally, you can see that the outcomes are expressed here as the healthy people objectives. And that's because that's consistent with our mission. However, as we know, whether or not we can measure our impact, our coalition's impact on breastfeeding outcomes, is unclear. But next, I'd like to present you with 2 brief examples of how we can operationalize this model in practice, and then I'll turn the presentation over to Michelle Vancourt so she can highlight a more specific example of how the model guides our evidence-based advocacy work in Connecticut. So as I previously discussed, coalition formation and development, as well as relationships and knowledge, can strengthen a coalition's capacity to affect community health outcomes. Examples of the model in action are related to these 3 constructs. So formation and development, and then relationships and knowledge. The first example is with regard to formation and development. At the 2012 annual meeting of the corporation of the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition, our members voted to amend our bylaws to create 6 committees that reflect the 6 sectors according to the call to action. So in essence, this gives us a rational way to divide the work, but more importantly, by including this in our bylaws, evidence-based advocacy can become woven into the fibers of the organization, and subsequently that can also have an effect on our sustainability when leaders change, etc. One concrete organizational activity is that we simply just organize the website according to the sectors. We also began to organize our statewide conferences this way. One of the highlights of the 2012 conference, so over a year ago, was that we honored community members according to their contributions in each sector. So if you go to our website and click on this link, you should be able to see a list of the awardees. The second example is about relationships and knowledge. So if we consider that relationships and knowledge may strengthen our capacity to promote community change, then using the action framework divided by sector can help us to promote evidence-based exchanges of knowledge among those sectors. As you can see, our officers and directors have the skills. This is an organizational chart of our leadership. So our officers and directors have the skills and knowledge to communicate information between sectors and the general community. A few unique examples are that our treasurer, see if I can find that pen again, is that our treasurer here is also an actuary, and that's been very helpful given our current interest in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. We also have a board member who oversees the Mothers and Families sector, and she's affiliated with the U.S. Institute on Human Rights, and she's added dimensions that at least I hadn't considered and we hadn't considered as a coalition in the past, such as incarcerated mothers and breastfeeding. And she was also essential in passing our legislation regarding jury duty accommodations for nursing mothers in 2011. And then, of course, Dr. Vancour is here today to illustrate how relationships and knowledge in the research and surveillance sector might strengthen advocacy efforts toward improved outcomes. As just a quick adjunct to example 2, I just wanted to highlight that our 2013 conference just back in September focused on breastfeeding disparities. And we awarded all of Connecticut's peer counselors with the Communities Award. We also provided them with scholarships to attend the conference as a way to build further local capacity in knowledge and relationships. We offered clinical and advocacy sessions and continuing education credits. Because the peer counselors are overseen by our state WIC department in Connecticut, the communities board, the community sector board liaison, and the public health infrastructure board liaison, who is also our Department of Public Health representative, work together to coordinate the attendance and the awards for the peer counselors. So this is a photo of Connecticut's awesome peer counselors. I said 2 examples, but I'm going to sneak in 1/3 very quickly. One final quick point is that I highly recommend writing action plans in order to establish how the proposed activity aligns with your mission and goals, as well as how the proposed action aligns with the evidence and what evidence specifically. It also helps to plan for accountability. For example, if you document which sector the action or activity falls under, there's accountability for which coalition leader will oversee the action. And if anybody would like more info on that or a template, you can feel free to email me. So just the key points of the action model. It was inspired by the call to action. The CBC formally adopted the call to action as a framework to organize and select our activities. And the action model is definitely still a work in progress. So for lots of important reasons, breastfeeding coalition leaders, members, volunteers, our community partners, all of us together, otherwise known as breastfeeding advocates, believe that breastfeeding is important to communities. And I suspect our coalition is not the only coalition nationwide to wonder from time to time if what we're doing is actually making a difference. Even if we have yet to document a direct relationship between our work and our breastfeeding outcomes, I believe that if we can move toward a model of evidence-based advocacy, we can create those changes locally that will make breastfeeding the norm nationally. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to now turn it over to Michelle Vancour.
Michelle, I think you have controls. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I'm sorry. My button's not coming up again for me to switch over. Here we go. It's just delayed. Perfect.
Okay, we can see it. There you go.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. As noted, I am the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition's liaison for the research and surveillance sector. I'm excited to talk to you today about how the action model is helping to advance the research and surveillance sector. First, I'd like to draw your attention back to the model, and in particular to the research and surveillance piece of the pie. As Michelle presented, the model is dependent upon interrelationships among the sectors and all of the other components. Many areas like the assessment, planning, evaluation, and insurance are continuous, happening at all levels, often simultaneously, with a life course potentially focusing on men and women infused throughout the evidence-based advocacy approach. As we move into the example I'm about to present, we will look specifically at the different areas of the model, moving from the outer levels to the center. Let's start with research and surveillance. With regard to the Surgeon General's call to action, our endeavors currently are focused on actions 17 and 18. Presenting them in reverse order here, action 18, strengthening existing and developing future capacity for conducting research on breastfeeding, is operationalized through our relationship with public health students at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Since 2012, 6 undergraduate students have done their internships supporting the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition's work across all the sectors. Several other undergraduate and graduate students have framed their independent research projects around breastfeeding, providing evidence to support the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition's mission and goals. In an effort to address the respective actions of mothers and their families, communities, and research and surveillance sectors, the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition decided to devise a plan to collect information from men, including fathers, to direct interventions and inform promotion methods. The final decision was to create a study to examine men's beliefs, opinions, attitudes, and perceptions of breastfeeding. The study was awarded a small $5,000 research grant by the Connecticut State University system. The financial support will help recruit participants and cover related expenses such as travel, facilitation, transcription, incentives, and refreshments. Using focus groups to collect rich data directly from men, the expectations are to uncover new approaches to support breastfeeding mothers, identify gaps in men's knowledge that can be addressed through future education methods, and inform a targeted statewide breastfeeding promotion campaign. The focus groups will be audio taped, which will be transcribed to facilitate data analysis and identify themes in men's responses. The results will inform future Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition education and promotion activities. And you see here on this slide that directly the research is responding to actions 1, giving mothers the support they need to feed their babies, and action 2, developing programs to educate the fathers and grandmothers about breastfeeding. This study involves a collaborative approach with the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition liaisons representing the affected domains or sectors of the Surgeon General's call to action, as well as the Connecticut Department of Public Health. With the invaluable support of several of our WIC sites, men are receiving invitations, as I'm speaking right now, to participate in focus groups at convenient locations within their communities. The first community-based focus group is scheduled for the last week in February. Additionally, men from one of the state universities participated last week in one of 2 focus groups that are planned there. I also want to mention at this point that public health undergraduate interns also have been working alongside us throughout every stage of this research endeavor, which is providing them with practical application of the skills they've gained throughout their studies. The research group interview guide includes questions that are open-ended and framed around the key barriers identified in the Surgeon General's call to action. These barriers are knowledge, social norms, family and social support, embarrassment, lactation problems, employment and childcare, and health services. We have allowed a little over an hour for each focus group, which will include 6 to 12 men. This combination will allow adequate time for participants to reflect, as well as time to capture their responses to each item. I also should note that refreshments and a small incentive will be provided to men in acknowledgement and appreciation of their time participating in this study. The Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition hopes to demonstrate that breastfeeding is men's business too in Connecticut. Capitalizing on the Surgeon General's call to action, acknowledgement that dads play a pivotal role in infant feeding and related decisions, we hope to identify areas where we can help men to support women in overcoming barriers to meet their breastfeeding goals. By including men of different ages and ethnicities and at different locations in the state, regardless of their experiences with breastfeeding, the results of the focus group study will be able to provide recommendations for education at various points across the lifespan, which is a central part of the action model. In conclusion, collaboration is demonstrated key to success for evidence-based advocacy. By applying the action model to the example of this study, we see that the results can advance evidence-based advocacy to promote, protect, and support breastfeeding. The action model frames the work of the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition and the results of this study, as well as other Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition actions, as Michelle mentioned. They target intermediate goals that indirectly can impact breastfeeding outcomes. I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Michelle. I'm going to switch back the presentation here and just remind everyone that you can ask questions by typing into the questions box on your webinar control panel. So please go ahead and type in the questions at this time if you have questions to ask of either of our presenters. I do see we have a few already, so I'm going to check out what we have so far. Bear with me one second. So we have a few logistical questions, actually. One is about what are your current sources of funding at the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition, and what are the challenges that you face as your funding started to pick up? I know you talked about a couple of sources of funding during the presentation.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can both answer this. Our current sources of funding, and I think that this is something that's shared among many coalitions in the U.S., our funding sort of comes and goes. We have very few operating expenses. And as I mentioned in one of the first slides, we really do run on volunteer efforts. But our funding is largely collaborative. So we had some funding. We contracted with the Connecticut Department of Public Health via their CPPW funding for the Connecticut Breastfeeding Initiative, which ran between 2010 and 2012. So that was one source of funding. For certain projects like this, we are sort of tapping our community resources, like Dr. Van Coort, who has access to some grant funding to do this study. Michelle, was there anything else that you can add? I mean, the conferences.
Yeah,
too.
That's what I was going to say. The only other thing that really is the conferences generating a little bit of revenue each year from that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. A couple of other similar questions. I think you started to answer this already, but are your officers and board members all volunteer, or are any of them having paid positions? And then a corollary to that question is, how do you recruit your officers and board members that are in those liaison positions? Did it change at all how you do that recruitment with the action model?
I think that's a really good question, actually. The first part of that question, I think I answered at the beginning. We are all volunteers. We don't have any paid administrative positions, which we've talked about in the past. You know, how might we get funding to hire an executive director, but then ultimately someone has to oversee that position. So, you know, this is something that we've gone back and forth on. But as of now, we are all volunteers. We do a lot of recruiting just in our own networks, and I think that's something we didn't talk about, but something that we might explore as part of the action model, is that in terms of capacity building, you know, for example, having Michelle Van Coort overseeing the research and surveillance sector, she can reach out to the academic community and has access to that community much more broadly than someone else might. And so in terms of recruiting, we really do a lot of asking. I might meet someone who, is clearly very interested in breastfeeding for whatever reason, and in the past, I think we might have focused on whether that person was an IBCLC, but now we know that we need to garner the support of everyone in our community. So we ask. We say, why don't you come to our meeting? We'd love to have you be more involved.
Great advice for for all of us. Sometimes just asking makes a difference. Let's see. Oh, we have a couple other questions. A couple about different types of partnerships. There's a question about if you have any regional or local breastfeeding coalitions or advocacy groups and how you work with them, and then also local chapters of some of the national breastfeeding organizations, such as ILCA or AAP. Do you utilize partnerships with any of those types of groups?
Yes, we absolutely do. We have, of course, in our state, so many people who are very visible in the breastfeeding community at the national level and the international levels as well. We have the fabulous Dr. Marinelli, of course, who chairs the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee, and she keeps us up to date on lots of things. There was another part of that question. Oh, other regional and local. We have representation from La Leche League, and we have tried to create this new partnership with our peer counselors. I also can say that we reached out to the Connecticut chapters of the National Black Nurses Association when we had our conference this past fall, because we did focus on disparities, and we understand the disparities. And again, this is the evidence that we're aware of, the disparities, racial and ethnic disparities, just among our lactation professionals. And so we did reach out to them and offer scholarships, so we have been in contact with the presidents of those local chapters. And there are lots of other examples too, but I'd also point out that, Connecticut is a small state, and so, a state like California may have many, many more organizations to organize. Michelle, did you have anything else about that?
No, I think you covered it for that.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions that are around meetings. I'll consolidate a couple here. One is just about how often do you have membership meetings and how often do you have board meetings? And then a corollary to that question is if you have any suggestions on how meetings are organized and how you get more folks engaged and involved in your meetings.
So we meet monthly. We have a standing meeting time, and we meet monthly. We have been hosted by Middlesex Hospital, which is a baby-friendly hospital in Middletown, Connecticut, and they provide us with our meeting space. And our board meets quarterly. In terms of, what was the other part of that question, Megan? Organizing
just any
meetings?
Suggestions about how you organize your meetings or how you get more folks engaged in the meeting?
Well, I think the membership of the meeting, and others may have this experience as well as a state coalition, we're kind of challenged. We meet in the middle of the day, which of course is challenging for a lot of people who are working. Some are able to come, are supported and able to come through their work. But our meetings probably range from, we might have 15 people, and then on the upper end we might have 30. Which is probably large. In terms of organizing our meetings, we have an agenda that goes out, a formal agenda that goes out prior to the meeting. Anybody certainly is able to contribute to the agenda. I don't know if that answers the question or not. I can say that in terms of our strategic planning, we're starting another process now, and we're going to have the liaison from each sector present and work through a SWOT analysis with the membership. So, that's just another way that we're using the call to action. I hope that answers the question.
Yep, that's great. More questions are coming in as we talk. One question was about the survey that Dr. Van Koor referred to around barriers. Is that available to other coalitions?
It definitely could be. I'm happy to share that. It would probably be a good thing to send an email if someone's interested. At some point we might put more information about the study once it's complete on the Connecticut Breastfeeding Coalition website as well. Could check in there, but I'm happy for people. Well, people are welcome to email me directly.
Okay. Do you want to? What I could do? How about I will post. If it's okay with you, I can send that person your email address in the chat. So stay tuned for just a moment, and I'll do that when we have announcements. Let's see. A couple other questions about meetings and membership. Is the coalition open to all? What's the membership structure, and are there any fees?
That's a good question. Yes, the answer is yes. The membership is open to all. The fees are minimal. I think we may be up to now $25 a year, maybe $30. I can't remember offhand. But so we charge a nominal fee, and starting this year we managed to, working with our web designer and with our great treasurer, or organize our website so that people could join or contribute via PayPal through our website. And the reason why we don't really charge that much is because, and we'll probably work through this with our strategic planning, and that is that we're not sure what we're offering members. So that's something, that is an area that we need to work through. We've also talked about inviting, having different levels of membership, so individuals can become members, but also organizations can become members for, for maybe more money, but we haven't really broached that.
Fabulous. Well, I want to be aware of our time here, so thank you so much, Michelle and Michelle. That was really great information, and the action model was very relevant to the national coalition at USBC as well. It was very cool to see how you have been applying the call to action and using that with a different structure for action at the state level. So thank you so much for sharing today. I'm going to turn it over now to CDC, and I believe Larry Grummerstrand is on the line with a couple of announcements from CDC.
All right, thank you, Megan. Are you able to hear me all right?
I can hear you.
All right, thank you. So just two announcements today. First, wanted to let you know about the CDC budget. We were quite pleased at the end of January to see that the Congress actually passed an omnibus appropriations bill for fiscal year 14, first time this has happened in several years. And this increases our funding for developing programs in breastfeeding. The budget uses the Prevention and Public Health funds, and CDC was awarded $8 million this year for breastfeeding work. That's an increase from $2.5 million last year. This is actually the first time that Congress has actually directly appropriated funds to CDC for breastfeeding. In the past, those funds were part of HHS discretion and were granted by the Secretary, which was certainly important for us, but it's very, very critical that we actually move this into a congressional appropriation, and this was the first time that we achieved that. We're currently in the process of developing our funding priorities for the year and writing the solicitation announcements. Unfortunately, at this point, until those decisions are made and everything is public, I can't share any more details about the process. But just know that we are in the process of working out a much larger program than we've had in the past. The second announcement I wanted to share is about CDC's maternity care review. We've commissioned an external review of our work on maternity care practices, particularly focused on the MPINC survey. We have a contractor, McCain Consulting, who will be pulling together a group of experts to examine the performance of the MPINC survey over the last 6 years that we have operated the system and make suggestions to us on how we could improve the questionnaire, the administration of the survey, how it's scored, how we report back to the hospitals, to state health departments and other actors, so that we can really maximize the impact of the survey. If you personally would like to be part of this external review, process or know someone that you think should be included on the review panel, please send an email to Kat Sheely at CDC, or I'm sure if you send the information to Megan or anyone at USBC, they can get that information forwarded on to Kat Sheely. She's the one coordinating that panel on our behalf. Those were the key announcements for today. Thank you very much, Megan.
Wonderful. Thank you, Larry. I just have a couple of quick announcements from USBC that actually will be quite relevant to some of you that were asking questions towards the end about coalition structure and function and funding. Kinkini and I are very pleased to announce the new webinar series that we have been calling the Coalition's Power Tools series. We are ready to launch that, and we had talked with you about that a couple of webinars ago, and now we have some dates picked out. So you'll see that these are happening in the off months from these webinars, and we've picked out the first 3 topics. Are several that we've been getting a lot of great questions and needs from all of you in wanting to hear more about these topics. So I would just note especially that on the March 18th one is more of the introductory 101 level governing documents, but we are going to cover some introduction to the IRS 990 there. I know many coalitions have been getting their IRS tax exemption and getting into that filing status for the first time. And so we wanted to do some touch on this in March because the deadline is May 15th. So we didn't want to leave all of that until the May webinar. So we will do some intro to that IRS 990 requirements. And then in May, we'll go on a deeper dive into the 990 as well as talking about state reports and insurance. We're very excited to be able to promote a new resource for all of you around insurance and risk management. I know that's been another very common question we've been getting from many states. So looking forward to that one. And then July, we will talk about advocacy and more around the real truth behind restrictions and requirements for being a nonprofit and what you can and can't do. We'll give you the real straight skinny on that in July, just in time for the conference. So please mark your calendars for these dates. These will be promoted in just the same way that we do these regular bi-monthly webinars on the even-numbered months. They're just going to be occurring in the odd-numbered months. My second announcement then is just a repeat of some of the information that we've shared with you on the past couple of calls around the conference, so I'm not going to repeat all of the detail, but rather refer you to this link down at the bottom. This is the key landing page website for the 2014 Coalitions Conference, and so there's a wealth of information there already, including information about the conference objectives and theme, the new name of the conference, and the attendance information and the status of different types of funding support. So please do check out that link and bookmark that, as we will continue to post news there. The key highlights I would say for today is actually down at the bottom here under this 4th bullet. The exhibitor and marketing prospectus will be posting later this evening, and the call for proposals will launch. It is imminent in the final testing stages of the form. So please watch for both of those things, both as individual emails that you'll receive through the Coalition's announcement list that you all are on, as well as in the weekly Wednesday Wire. You'll see both of those multiple ways. And finally, again, just to plug that right after the conference, we will have the Day of Action on Monday, August 4th, and we hope that everyone will attend. It's a great opportunity for coalitions to be visible and seen and heard and building relationships with your congresspersons. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and adjourn our webinar today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And if you are one of the folks that's dialing in for your regional call, you will need to disconnect or hang up from this line and dial into that regional number that would come from your designated contributors in your state. And then again, for everyone, please do watch for the evaluation link, which you'll receive by email in about an hour from the GoToWebinar system. So thank you again, and we will talk with you soon on the next webinar. Take care.